Hello, everybody, and welcome to Fiore Calls Game. I am your host, Andrew Fiore, here on 321 Media, and we are sponsored by CC O'Brien's in Pawcatuck, Connecticut, one of the best spots to go watch a game, get some wings, and enjoy. We have a very special guest on today. I'll put it this way. If you're at a sporting event and that event is in Rhode Island or Massachusetts, he's probably there. It's Bill Koch from the Providence Journal. Bill, great to see you. Thanks for taking some time this afternoon.
Andrew, thanks for having me. It's my pleasure.
Of course. Well, I'll get things started with what you were doing last night. For those of you who missed it, the Patriots defeated the Jets last night on Thursday Night Football. I believe that was 27-14.
Yep.
And Bill was in the building, and there's an atmosphere around this Patriots team that we haven't seen since Tom Brady. What was it like in the building, covering them at the press conferences? What was the vibe you got?
Feels like the good old days. We're back there, 9-2. They've got a quarterback, clearly Drake May, who's in the MVP conversations. You had Rob Gronkowski, Vince Wilfork, Randy Moss, all in the building last night. It felt like those special championship days when the Patriots were playing in prime time all the time.
So covering a primetime event like that for you, and you do a lot of high school sports, college sports in the area, but what does that look like for you? Getting on the big stage, going to Gillette. What was your work day like?
Well, it's a different day, obviously. I went up with Jake Russo, who I work with the Providence Journal. We carpooled. We left his place in Cranston about 3 o'clock in the afternoon. And I think I walked in the door last night about 3 a.m. So football's a long day. You try to beat the crowds, and you're there for a long time after the game, just going through the quotes that you've gathered and the stories that you want to write and the angles that you want to pursue. But it's worth it. I mean, to call it work or to call it difficult is to require some perspective. If I want to see what hard work looks like, I could think about my dad who, worked a 9 to 5 every day and had to wake up and shave and put on a tie every day for 40 years or so. Or I think about my brother who's a firefighter in Pawtucket. Who is dealing with real life issues every day. So I'm fortunate to have them in my life because they remind me that I get to play fun and games a little bit, and that my job is supposed to be enjoyable.
And during the game, what are you doing for work? What are you doing during the game? What are you looking for specifically when you prepare to write an article?
Well, just like you would before you do play-by-play, you have some storylines going in, and if the game sort of conforms to those, if those play out, then you explore them a little further after the game with the folks who you talk to, whether it's Mike Vrabel or the players. If you have something unexpected happen, you sort of try to find reference points for that. If somebody throws for 500 yards for the first time at Gillette Stadium, or somebody scores 8 touchdowns or something like that, you're constantly trying to reframe it after that. So you're watching the game, but you have in mind some footnotes that you're taking down, maybe some pieces that you'd like to get into, and you just sort of see what you have at the end, and you see what you can get for quotes, and then you go from there.
Were there any storylines you had in mind coming into last night's game that didn't end up being a factor?
Maybe one thing that I thought about before the game was Will Campbell being an LSU guy and Andrew Whitworth being there with the Amazon Prime broadcast last night. He's an LSU guy. They're both from Louisiana. So maybe if Campbell had a terrific game, or if they had rushed for 200 yards or something like that, I could have approached Campbell in the locker room and asked him if he knows Whitworth, if they got a chance to link up during the pregame, how much he watched him as a kid when he was at LSU, or, whether or not he's spoken with him, throughout the draft process or his rookie year. Maybe that was something that the beat writers who were there every day did during the week leading up to the game. But that was probably the only thing that we didn't really touch. Otherwise, it was Drake May, it was Trevion Henderson playing more snaps without Ramondre Stevenson. It was Stephon Diggs continuing to play well. Defense continuing to perform. It was basically, as far as football games go, it was fairly routine.
Now, you've had a lot of interactions with players over the years, and obviously there's a different culture at Gillette than there was last year. Can you see that when talking to these guys? Are their demeanors different from last year?
Yeah, I mean, everyone's in a better mood when you win, right?
Yeah.
I say all the time, I don't root for the teams that I cover, whether it's high school, college, pros. It really doesn't matter. But everyone's in a better mood when you win. Everyone is more willing to engage and talk when they're winning, when there's a good vibe in the building. When it feels like they're headed to something or building something. It's very difficult when you're 4-13 and you have to answer the same questions week after week about why you're struggling and why things aren't working. It's very difficult to go over that. Covering Providence basketball last year, they were 12-20 and only won once after February 1st, and it was very difficult in those press conferences to talk about why you're struggling and why you can't get it done, and what's happening out there. You run out of questions at some point. So these are the good problems to have when a team is winning that you're covering. In terms of different angles that you want to pursue. This is the good stuff.
Yeah, I mean, this is what you hope to see out of guys like Drake May, that they can get some winning experience this early in their career. What do you make of him off the field in the sense of something that you'd see as a reporter that the fans may not see behind the scenes?
I wouldn't say that I know Drake all that well. I'm not up there every day, but I don't necessarily think that he's someone completely different off camera than he is on. He seems kind of unassuming. He's certainly enjoying himself. I know he's been out to a couple Celtics games with Will Campbell, and they've been out to eat in the North End a few times, and those are some of the perks that come with being a Patriots quarterback when you're 9-2. You want to be seen in public. You want to get out on the town. It's nice when people like what you're doing and recognize that. So I'm sure he's experiencing the best of the region right now. Last year, he probably experienced some of the worst of it. I wouldn't imagine that he was out as much after a game or, on an off day on a Tuesday or, on a bye week. He might have gotten away at those points. He might have just stayed in and studied more and tried to work on himself. But I certainly think that the guys in there seem to respect him. They certainly recognize that he's playing well, and your quarterback doesn't have to be the quote unquote leader, but it's certainly nice when he can do so with his performance and with his attitude.
Now, that might have been a question more for someone like Mike Reese, who's there all the time, day in and day out. But how
Yes.
often do you get to Gillette?
So I've been to 3 games this year and went to a couple training camp practices. We're not really there much during the week because we have other things going on with high schools and colleges in Rhode Island. But I certainly think as they continue to win and interest continues to grow in this team, we're going to follow where the story is. And, right now, with it looking like they're going to play into January in the playoffs and maybe beyond, that's something that we'll dip our toes into a little bit more in the coming weeks.
Yeah, and your average day is spent covering high school sports, something we focus a lot on here. We cover Westerly football for one, and they are
Sure.
certainly making a name for themselves. We get a lot of Westerly perspectives on this channel about the team, but what do you see someone as someone who's objective, looking at all the teams? What do you make of this Westerly team that maybe the fans here who only really watch Westerly week in and week out wouldn't notice compared to other teams?
Well, just start at the beginning. It's one of the best high school football communities in the state. A Friday night game at Westerly is something different compared to some other places. The joke for people who don't live there is they roll up the sidewalks at 6 and they play at 7. That's essentially how it works there. But it's always been a big deal to play football at Westerly. I know when I was playing at Pilgrim in the 90s, Westerly was one of the teams that everyone looked at and said they're going to be a good team. They'll be a tough out on the schedule. You really hope that you play them at home because you don't want to go all the way down there and play them in front of their fans. It would be difficult. Ron Spizzato is a town guy. He embraces that culture. He's also the baseball coach there. I think he's a really good steward for those two programs. And certainly Landon Husero has been the best quarterback in the state the last 2 years. He's a really special talent. Gotten to see him grow up. I remember the first time I interviewed him, he was a freshman, and he played so well on the field. And then you talk to him after the game and he takes his helmet off and you're just like, oh, this is a 14-year-old boy. This isn't a man yet, despite what you see between the lines. And, over these last 2 or 3 years, he's really grown up a lot. He's taken a leadership role on that team and is a guy with a really bright future. So just in terms of that program and the way the community embraces it, it's always going to be one of the best stories in Rhode Island high school sports.
What do you make of their matchup this week in the playoffs?
Well, styles make fights, as I've said before. West Warwick wants to keep the ball on the ground and run it and keep it away from Westerly. And, we know the Bulldogs want to score and get up and down the field and, try to play the game in the 30s or the 40s. And, we'll see which style prevails over the other. I think I picked the Bulldogs this week in our Providence Journal picks column. And my thinking was, Westerly won the regular season game last year against West Warwick and lost in the playoffs. And this year, I think it'll be the reverse. They lost in the regular season, but they've gotten a little healthier. They've gotten a chance to see West Warwick. They've got them coming down there now, to play on the road again. It's second long road trip for West Warwick going down there. So I expect Westerly to come out on top, and I would expect another close game as well.
Do you have a harder time covering Westerly, given how we're kind of, from a Rhode Islanders perspective, separated by miles and miles and eons from the rest of the schools?
Yeah, the ridiculous, oh no, I have to drive 40 minutes to a game instead of 15, right? No, it's just like anything else. You're just playing for it. Like I have LaSalle Cranston West tonight at 7 o'clock, and I know the traffic will be difficult getting into Providence, and I know that there's going to be a big crowd at that game. So, you make plans for it. I'll probably leave home in Warwick, no later than 4:30. I know Eric Rube has Bishop Hendricken at North Kingstown tonight. I think that's a 6 o'clock kickoff. They played early in the season, and the crowd was just incredible for that game. I would think Rube's going to get there at about 4 o'clock. Just to make sure he can get in the parking lot and make sure he gets a spot, because they're going to have literal thousands at that game. It will be capacity. It will sell out. So just like anything else, you just have to prepare for it, have a time frame in mind, and stick to that.
How are those days when you have to hop around from high school to high school?
There aren't too many. When you get into the playoffs sometimes and you have staggered start times, like somebody might play at 3 and somebody might play at 6:30. You try to hit 2 games in one day. But for the most part, it's just going to be one. And I guess you run into multiple games in a day when you get into state championship season, like soccer playoffs. You had 4 girls championships on Saturday and 3 on Sunday. They're all back to back at Rhode Island College at one venue. So those are long days, and certainly you're trying to do justice to each story that you write from those. You want to bring the same level of energy to each game. And, by the end of the weekend, it's a long grind mentally, certainly. But that's the fun stuff. You have to embrace the fact that the kids are celebrating championships, that, they're celebrating achievements at the end of long seasons. And, that sort of renews your energy in a way and brings you into their story. So I guess a lot of this is just mentally how you approach the job and your assignments. And, you have to treat them with the correct amount of respect and perspective that they deserve.
And you treat them similarly to how you would treat a college or pro event, or do you change your lens a little bit?
Well, in terms of how you would critique performance, I think you change things. You try to be softer, at the lower levels, whether it's like Little League Baseball, if you're at a state tournament, or, Little League World Series. You try to be softer in terms of criticism or in terms of pointing out errors. I'm more likely to glorify the winners at a lower level than I am to criticize the loser, because I think that's more fair. You're not dealing with compensated athletes when they're 12-year-old boys or 12-year-old girls.
Right.
In high school, there's a little higher burden. Certainly, it's a little more public, but it's still not your profession. You're still not being rewarded for it in a tangible way. Once you get to college, it changes a little bit. And certainly pro is different because that's your profession. That's your job. And my job is to analyze performance at that point. But I think there are levels to it, just like anything else. And I think the sooner you get a sense of what those levels are and where you can and can't go, the easier it will be for you.
How pivotal is it for you to have a partner like Rube who is taking on the mantle of high school sports and really ingrained himself in the culture here in Rhode Island?
Yeah, anything you do is a team effort. Obviously, working with Rube and Jake Russo and our boss, Bill Corey, who is just such a steady hand in the department. He's able to be your boss without you feeling like he is commanding you in certain ways. He is steering us more than he is demanding us. He is guiding us more than he is pointing at us in a certain direction. And I think that's the most effective leadership style that I could work for. It works for me best. And obviously the folks behind the scenes who were on the copy desk, whether that was Mark Cassingay, who just retired after 50 plus years at the Journal, Steve Cumming, who's been on the copy desk for a while, the men and women who came before them, who worked, who see all the stuff behind the scenes before it hits the web or print. They're invaluable because they're your safety net. I write my story, I send my videos, and that's it. And they're picking the photos, they're writing the headlines, they're making sure that I have a comma instead of a period, or that I spelled everyone's name correctly. It really is a team effort with this sort of thing. It's not just us who are out front you might see every day.
How do you operate under pressure when it comes to deadlines? I remember one time in the bowels of the AMP, I saw you plugging away trying to hit a deadline at the exact minute, and you got it done, and everybody was just like, "Look at this guy work." Do you thrive under that sort of pressure?
Yeah, I was, like a lot of people, I'm sure, I was a big procrastinator in high school and in college, and don't even talk to me about it until it's almost due. I don't want to hear it. I know that's not always the most productive way to work, but it works for me. Our deadline structure has changed a lot since I got into the industry. We're obviously not as print driven. We're much more internet focused now. So our deadline schedule is all over the place. I honestly couldn't tell you what it is at this point. I really don't know. Every once in a while, I'll ask Bill Corey. I'll say, "What's a drop dead on this?" And he'll give me a time, and I'll say, "Well, that's not going to happen." Um, and some other times I'll say, "All right, we got a chance at it." And it forces you to lock in. It's just like I don't want to compare myself to being an athlete when you're writing on deadline, but mentally, it forces you to lock in. It forces you to focus. To really organize your thoughts and be clear and concise. And I always say, like, when you get to the end of your story, just press send. Perfect is the enemy of good. Once you go back and you edit and you try to re-edit and you try to re-edit, you're 10 minutes down the line and you're away from something that you might have sort of liked initially. And now you've got something that you don't like at all. So get to a point where you're satisfied with it. Not everything is going to win a Pulitzer Prize. Hit send, you did the job, come back the next day.
What's the most articles you've had to write in one day?
If you end up, if you go to something like a Big East Media Day for basketball, which I did last month in October, I think I had 7 or 8 bylines from Madison Square Garden.
Wow.
And they weren't all, like 1,500 word pieces or anything like that. A couple of them were longer than others, and a couple of them were shorter, maybe 400 or 500 words. That was sort of, you go down there with a list in mind and you send your editor a story budget. This is what I'm thinking about doing. Do you have any other ideas? And, they might come back and say, well, what about this or what about that? And you would say, I hadn't thought of that. That's a great idea. I forgot that this person was going to be there, or that this player transferred to this school, or this coach had been hired, and so it's collaborative in that way. And then you attack the day and you see what you can get. And Big East Media Day, because of the way it's structured, it's open. Players and coaches are sitting at tables around the floor at Madison Square Garden. There's great access to them for about a half hour for each team. So you can get around the building and gather your quotes and sort of have an idea of the questions you want to ask to each person. And then after that, it's just about executing your story ideas. Using your preparation and your quotes, bringing those two things together, and coming up with a story that you can send in. So that I think I had 7 or 8 bylines out of the Big East tournament, out of the Big East Media Day. I think when you go to the NCAA tournament with basketball, if you have something like Bryant, they were in Cleveland last year. I think the open media day before the game, I probably had 5 or 6 stories out of that day. Because there are just a lot of angles to pursue, and you want to justify the travel and the cost of it. You want to serve your readers well, who might not be able to make the trip. And you want to sort of uncover some things that you can with more access. It's not just somebody at a podium like it might be throughout the regular season. You might be able to get into a locker room or get a player one-on-one. That's the whole point of making the trip, is for that access. So, every once in a while you have a really busy day, and some other times you don't.
Well, thinking about the Big East Media Days, and like you said, getting close access to those coaches. Correct me if I'm getting any details of this wrong. It was a while ago, but I feel like I remember when I was interning at WPRI, Dan Hurley came into the press conference after beating Providence, and I think he said hello directly to you personally as he was getting on the podium. I could be thinking of Ed Cooley, honestly, but you form those relationships with those guys who go on to big things like winning March Madness, and you stick in their minds, apparently.
Well, so when Dan was at URI, I was covering URI for the South County Independent and then for the Journal. I got hired to cover URI sports and high schools. I replaced the great Paul Kenyon, who retired. That was essentially his beat, and I was already doing it just at a lower level, for a weekly. And when they brought me into work for a daily, URI wasn't very good at that point. Dan was in his 2nd or 3rd year, I think, when I got hired at the Journal, and they wound up in the NIT his 3rd season. His 4th year, E.C. Matthews got hurt very early in the season. That was kind of a lost year. And then the next 2 years, I made the NCAA tournament. And credit to my bosses at the Journal at the time. Mike McDermott was the sports editor then. They put a lot of emphasis on URI and PC basketball, and so I was on those road trips. Usually the only local media member who was traveling with them. And so because of that, you get a lot of FaceTime with the coach and with the players and, with the people around the program. And, it gets to a point where you're just part of the furniture. Like, you see them in the hotels after a game, or, you see them at the airport because they were flying commercial at the time. And so were you. So you might've been on some of the same flights that they were. And a lot of this job is just showing up every day, being accessible, being on, being engaging, willing to talk to people. And that's not always the easiest for me, because I'm I have a little bit of Eeyore in my nature, sometimes, professionally and personally. I have some days where I just want to pull the covers over my head and let it rain outside. But when you're in that sort of venue and you have that sort of responsibility, you owe it to the people you work for and to the people who consume your content, to try to make the effort. And certainly when Dan was here, you recognize that he was a different sort of guy. The thing I appreciated working with him was he was straightforward to a fault. You always knew where you stood with him. Whether that was good or bad, he would come to you and say, "Hey, I didn't like what you wrote, or I didn't like what you said," and you could say to him, "All right, let's talk about it. Let's go ahead. Let's just have it out now." Because he was not hiding from confrontation. He was not passive aggressive. He wouldn't circle back 3 weeks later and say, "Oh, well, 3 weeks ago you did this to me," and it's like, no. Like, he was right there. He's going to fight you for 5 minutes. He's going to blow out, and then it's done. 2 weeks later, he wouldn't think about it at all. So it was a good experience covering him. He had some great teams. He had some wonderful kids on those teams. His staff was always very engaging. So I really enjoyed my time covering him at URI, and, I know the fans enjoyed the program that he built there.
Is there any part of you in that moment when the 2-time March Madness champion comes up on the podium and starts his press conference by mentioning you, that's like, wow, that's really cool. Like, this is the most famous coach in college basketball right now, or has that been battered away by years of experience on this stage?
Well, I mean, for me, it's a little embarrassing because I don't want to be part of the story or part of the press conference or part of anything. I just want to ask my question and get out of there. But I think, my dad asks me this all the time. He's just like, you get to meet these athletes who we watch on TV. That's so cool. And I'm just like, it is. I'm like, but it's my job, Dad. It's not, yes, it is. I love watching people who are great at what they do, the best at what they do. I have so much appreciation for them. Whether it's an athlete or a coach, you appreciate their excellence, their greatness. But at the end of the day, it's a story you have to write. It's a deadline you have to meet. It's a responsibility that you have to your readers, to your bosses. And you need to come good on that. And it doesn't matter if it's Dan Hurley or Dan Smith or Dan Jones. That's the job. So I guess, I sort of approach it that way. Yes, I would, you certainly feel differently when you're covering a World Series game as opposed to game 14, if you're the Red Sox beat writer. But, at the end of it all, you're doing the same thing that you were. You need to stay in that routine, stick to your process and do the job.
Did you have years ago a moment where you had to learn that lesson the hard way, like a welcome to the NFL moment?
It's probably when I got laid off twice. What
happened there?
Well, in 2007, I was working with Koch at Call, and I got let go. Corporate restructuring. And then I think it was 2009 or 2010, I was working at the Independent for the first time and I got let go. And it wasn't a reflection on my performance. It's just the media business is very difficult, as you know. Companies are constantly consolidating. They're looking to cost cut a little bit. I've had colleagues lose their jobs, at the Journal as well. And you think about that sort of thing every day. You try to put it out of your mind, but it's out there. And so a lot of times I would say to, if I speak to a high school or college journalism class, it's cliche, but control what you can control. If you're not management, don't try to be management. Just do what you can do. If you're not on the business side, don't try to dictate business because it's not. Ultimately, it's not your decision to make. You're not qualified to make it. And what they decide, it generally isn't going to be a reflection on how you're doing the job or your performance or who you are. It's something that they saw on a spreadsheet somewhere. So all you can really do is just go about your business every day, and keep the people who are most important to you in mind when you do that. That's your family, your friends, partner, the folks who you work closest with, whether that's your direct boss or your colleagues. And beyond that, you just can't worry about what's out there. So those two were probably my welcome to the media industry moment. They were really difficult. The second one especially made me question whether or not I wanted to continue to do this because I felt like I loved being a sports writer. I wasn't certain if it loved me back. And that's difficult at the time. But, ultimately I think about that, and that's a few years ago now. And, I'm fortunate to still be doing this. I'll do it for as long as they want me to do it, as long as I think it's fun. And, ultimately, if they decide to go in another direction, or if I'm not having fun someday, I'll go do something else.
Is it something that's more on your radar in the newspaper industry in particular than it would be, say, if you were doing like TV or news?
Well, I mean, in TV, we just had a major shakeup in the market with Sinclair buying ABC6.
Ian and Nick,
I had friends at ABC6 who lost their jobs. And I still have friends who work there who aren't certain what the future is going to be. Whether or not they're going to be offered new contracts, whether or not there's going to be restructuring with respect to their corporate or to their content or, their on-air schedule or anything else. they're uncertain right now. All they can do is go to work every day and do the best they can. Because they're not management. They're not in charge of making those decisions, and they're not executives at Sinclair. So it's not unique to newspapers. It's radio, television, internet. You look at places like ESPN or The Athletic. I mean, they've shed jobs occasionally. That has happened. They've had buyouts. They've had forced retirements. You'll find that anywhere in the media industry, I would suspect, no matter what medium you operate in. It's just a reality of your day-to-day life.
Yeah, I had Nick Koch on not long after that merger, and he said similar stuff to what you were saying a bit ago, like control what you can control, be grateful for the people that you meet in those situations and trust that it's going to work out in the long run. Like he was talking about his relationship with Ian, who luckily is doing his thing at WMUR now up in New Hampshire. And that's another thing I noticed when I was interning, the relationship that all of you guys for the different outlets had. I came in expecting a little bit of a rivalry between the stations, just because of the stereotype rival stations. But turned out all of you guys were pals, and it really created a cool atmosphere. You've gotten to know guys like Sam Knox, who we've had on this show too, and again Ian, Nick, guys like that, and like Nicole Metner, and the whole Rhode Island media industry, guys and girls that like really do so much. What do those relationships mean to you, and are there any that have continued outside of the workplace?
Yeah, you were waiting for the back alley scene from Anchorman, weren't you? With the trident with brick and all that, right? Something like that. Yeah, that's not the way it is around here. It's the nature of Rhode Island. We're small, small state. So you're going to see these people all the time. We're all covering the same things. And in a lot of cases, we're on the road together. Whether it's Big East tournament, NCAA tournament, Super Bowls, World Series. We've been very fortunate in the last 2 decades or so where, Boston teams and our local college teams have had a pretty good run. And so we've had the opportunity to be in places together, sort of alone. We're at the arena or at the rink or we're at the field, and we're the only people there who know somebody else. It's sort of like you've got that small traveling group. And so you obviously you're staying in some of the same hotels. You go out at night, you socialize after work's done. And you form those relationships there. I would say, Coit's a very good friend of mine. Both through work and outside work. I think he's a terrific pro. He will land on his feet at some point. I know he's doing a lot of things right now, whether it's with Brown, teaching at URI. He's picked up some content at Providence. He's still got the radio show on EEI on the weekend. So, I don't worry about him whatsoever. Ian's departure was already in the works before this consolidation, which, I didn't know. He kept that very close to the chest. He came out with it after, and I was just like, oh, very good. Well done. I was like, you had us all fooled, Ian. But great for him. It's a great next step for him. And certainly the folks who work at other stations have been kind enough to have me on. I did the high school football show the other night with Sam and Morgan and an Neocon. Actually, Sam was out. He was away at a wedding for the weekend, so it was an Neocon, and Morgan had me in. Rube was trick-or-treating with his kids on dad duty, and I got drafted, and it was a great Friday night. I'm doing a college basketball show this season with Kevin Moore on Channel 10 on WJAR. We've recorded a couple episodes now. We're going to try to do it weekly. And, Kevin was an intern for Nick and Ian. I met him through them a couple times. And, when he came back into the market, obviously he's a local guy who grew up in Pawtucket, who knows the scene, who cares. He's a hard worker. I wouldn't agree to do a show with him if I didn't respect him. I could have just said no, because I don't need to make that time commitment, and I don't need to attach myself to someone who I don't want to work with or whose work I don't respect. But with Kevin, it was an easy yes, because I know that he puts in the time and the effort, and I'm happy to try to help him out in that way. But we've got a good group for sure, and you got some folks who are newer here and some folks who have been around a lot longer. But I would say that I appreciate the work that the other people do in this market, and I definitely appreciate seeing them out at games and on the road a little bit. I think it's it's just fun to be able to share some experiences and maybe bounce some ideas off some other people.
Yeah, I was gonna ask about a neocon because obviously he just came back into the market after being an intern. It must be cool to watch people go from interns to full-on anchors of their own.
Yeah, and neocon is an interesting case because like I said, I'm not management. I'm not involved in this sort of thing, but I thought PRI should have hired him right out of school. I mean, he was essentially doing the job already.
I think they tried.
It was he would be able to tell a story better than I would if you have him on. This was just an outsider, uninformed perspective. But I'm looking at this and I'm thinking, okay, he's interned for you. Then you brought him in to do part-time work. You're essentially giving him like 10, 20, 30 hours a week paid. Why not just upgrade that to full-time? What are we doing here? I know he had some idea that he wanted to get away for a little bit, and sort of establish himself somewhere else. And, I don't necessarily blame him for that. I understand that. I mean, I've worked in the market my whole career, and I'm a Rhode Island guy. I will wonder what it was like to be somewhere else, to try to force growth a little bit that way. And I think it worked out that way for him. I said to him the other night, after we got off the air on the Friday Night Football show, I said, Neocon, please don't take this the wrong way. I said, but the last 2 years, you've gotten so much better. I said, you're so pro. I said, you're so, your presentation is so good. Your delivery is so good. You've grown so much from when you were a student, or from when you were interning or working part-time at PRI. And that's just a couple of years. I can't wait to see where he is in like 10 years. Because I think he's so talented and works so hard. And for PRI to bring him back and to bring in Morgan at the same time, I think really good restructuring of their department on the fly. And I think they've got a bright future going forward.
Yeah, Neocon is somebody who said he'd like to come on, so at some point in the next few weeks, I'm gonna try to get him on.
Yeah.
I love seeing him return. I met him as a freshman, and he was a senior still at URI. And URI's got a unique system where it's kind of a similar culture, where it's a bunch of the same media students at the same events covering stuff. And you've always been personable with the students at URI when covering those events. Like, I remember chatting with you at some games at the desk. Uh, your thoughts on how URI has developed this sort of sports media brand over the years?
Yeah, the Harrington School has done a terrific job in recent years. Not only in terms of resources, but in terms of the people they brought in to be mentors to students. And the results speak for themselves. I mean, you look at where the graduates from URI are working right now. Even over the last 5 years. You look at someone like Nikki Lattarulo, who's working in a major market in New York. Kate Rogerson is working in a major market in Raleigh-Durham. And Neocon is here. You could run down the list. They've had so many recent successes come out of Harrington School. And, I think it's a product of their commitment to the students, to their educational process, to the technology, to the opportunities that they can provide. I know the folks behind the scenes there. Obviously, Koch's a professor there, so he's had a lot of these kids in class. Corey O'Leary is a big part of that. I've known Corey for a long, long time. Him doing production on events at the Ryan Center and at Meade Stadium. I know he's a great mentor if you're a young broadcaster and you have him as a producer. He's going to guide you through and give you the ins and outs, and maybe give you a couple pro tips of what to avoid and what you should lean into. When you have people like that around your program who care, who are invested, it affects the product. And in this case, the product is the students that they're graduating and putting out into the world. And, I just think it's great to have something like that in our backyard. URI was a school that I applied to a coming out of high school. I ultimately opted to go in a different direction, but the communications program that I applied to is basically unrecognizable compared to what they have right now.
I've got to know, out of all those companies that URI grads ended up with, obviously 321 Media with myself here, the highest on that list. I have to
Certainly.
mention that.
Certainly.
But no, we had Connor Calden on last week. He was a photographer for the Baltimore Orioles. He graduated with me, came out of that program.
Yep.
Did you always know you wanted to do writing in particular?
Well, so like anybody else who gets into sports media, I feel like we're all failed athletes in some way. I wanted to pitch for the Red Sox, and when I was about 12, I figured out that wasn't going to happen. When I didn't make my Little League All-Star team, I was crushed. I wore 21. I wanted to be Roger Clemens. I was right-handed. It wasn't going to work. So then I was a broadcast journalism major at Boston University. And I got into my third year, and I had a TV broadcast class with a guy named Ron Gollobin, who was on Channel 5 in Boston for about 35 years. He was a reporter there. And one of the things he said in the class that really stuck with me was we started to do on-camera packages and live hits from places and simulate those. And we'd watch them back in class and critique them, and you get a grade based on that. And Ron said, get used to watching yourself and decide if you can do this for the next 35 years. Because it's not the job that's going to drive you crazy. It's watching yourself. It's critiquing yourself. Why are my hands doing that? Why did my face do that? Why am I wearing this? And then you bring that out to the general public at large. They will critique you in the same way. Why is he or she wearing that? Why do they look like this? They should lose 20 pounds. That sort of thing. If you can handle that mentally, great. If not, you might want to seek something else, because it will be a very difficult existence for you. And for me, I watched myself on camera and thought, oh, no, this is not going to happen. This is not my path. I can't do this. So I started to look into radio and production and, writing. And I was, I always enjoyed reading as a kid. You had to take a lot of English classes as part of a comm degree at BU. I think I had to take 5, and 2 of them were Shakespeare, which was great. Got to read a lot of the classics, whether it was Hamlet or Macbeth or, Othello. And I really discovered that I enjoyed writing, and that for whatever reason, it came somewhat easily to me. I do these papers in college in a short period of time, and my dad would say to me, how did you wrote 20 pages overnight? How? That would take me a week. My brother would say the same, and I would think to myself, okay, so this might be a little bit different. Maybe I should explore this a little bit. And once you start doing it, it's like anything else. I was terrible at the start. I read my stuff from the Warwick Beacon like my first 3 or 4 years, and I'm just like, God, what were you doing? You're brutal. Like, this is awful. You stink. I can't believe they kept paying you. And that still happens every once in a while now. But it was definitely something that I saw as a better path, and it was something that I grew into. And now I couldn't imagine myself doing anything else, really.
I'm someone who I've reached a point where a few years ago I thought differently, but I would rather work my way up through this area rather than go somewhere, do something specific like broadcasting. Say I know I want to be a play-by-play guy. I'm gonna go out wherever it takes, then come like to a bigger market. I've realized I'm someone who I'd rather do whatever I can do in the industry in this region and work my way up that way, but staying here. Do you think that's where you were at as somebody who's only stayed in Rhode Island and really just enjoyed the area?
Well, I sort of got my first job by accident. I finished my degree and I moved home, and I needed to get a job, obviously. And, I grew up in Warwick, and my local newspaper was hiring, and they were paying $300 a week. And I was one of the finalists. I was the second choice. The person who they wanted to hire couldn't afford to take the job, so they gave it to me. I was living with my parents, so I wasn't paying rent. I didn't have a mortgage. There wasn't anything like that. So I was fortunate. that they took me in and allowed me to do that. My second job, I made a little bit more, and my third job, I made a little bit more, and this one, I make a little bit more. And I'm actually at the point now where I can make a living, instead of really struggling like some other people who are just starting out. But that took a lot of time and a lot of support. And, I'm really thankful to my parents, especially, for how they've backed me all the way through. How they've always supported me. They've always been in my corner. They've always been my biggest fans. I wouldn't be anywhere near where I am now without them. So working locally, it's nice because you have a certain amount of institutional knowledge. I don't need to figure out like how to drive to LaSalle or how to drive to Hendricken or who Jamal Gomes is or whatever, or who Alex Butler is. Like, I grew up with all this. So it does make it easier. But I think media, and especially on your side in broadcast, I think there are so many more opportunities now, even locally, because streaming is a thing, and colleges have seemingly unlimited content now. Before, it was all network. You had the majors, you had ESPN, you might have had one other sports network, and that was the only way that you got on the air. There was no internet content. There might have been some radio rights, but it was very limited. And now, going back to what URI has done with the Harrington School, you've got students who are on play-by-play while they're undergrads, building a reel, giving themselves a chance through real-world experience to get that first job or that second job right out of school. And so I think, based on streaming platforms and how much more is offered now on the internet, I think you could basically live anywhere and do what you do. Whether that's high school content, college content, whatever sport it may be, I think you can basically write your own ticket. I look at a guy like Mike Monaco, who is a star at this point, but he was an intern for the Pawtucket Red Sox. He was doing Cape Cod League baseball games, and he picked up some ESPN stuff on the side, and he was doing some baseball, and he had his name out there that way, and the right people got a hold of it and liked what he was doing, and his platform just grew and grew and grew, and now he's at the point where he's doing Wimbledon and the Australian Open, and he'd never done tennis a day in his life. I think he told me a couple of years ago the first tennis match he ever called professionally was Wimbledon, which is just crazy to think about, and that is because he had opportunity locally, largely because of technology and the internet, and he maximized it and pushed it forward. And I think you or anybody else in your position have similar opportunities coming out of school, or just starting out in your career, and those didn't exist 20, 25 years ago.
Yeah, I mean, I was gonna say, when you were talking about in your classes having to film reels and live location reports and then watch it back in class, I'm like, we never did that in class. But what we did do was go to the Ryan Center and call a game on ESPN Plus.
Right.
I was on air for a D1 mid-major basketball game literally 2 or 3 months into college, and I didn't think anything of it until I met some Syracuse kids, and Syracuse is, the standard in this industry, and they're like, "Oh boy, next year is my junior year. I can finally like be the background person on the radio." I'm like, "Oh, yeah, I didn't know how rare it is to have
Yeah.
what we have here."
Yeah, some markets are very competitive. Obviously, Syracuse is, very difficult to break into, whether it's football or men's basketball. There, that it's a long line of people, who want to get on the air there, or who want to write for the Daily Orange, which has some great alumni who work in media. And I think it's all about how prepared you are, and then how you can take advantage and execute once you do get a chance. And you've certainly seen in your time, around URI and then after, and certainly you've done it yourself. You've certainly seen how that can be beneficial, and what you can parlay it into. And I think everyone, if they have some sort of concept and some awareness, I think that chance is there for them.
I have to go back and ask because you mentioned that first local newspaper in Warwick. Would that happen to be the Beacon?
Yes, Warwick Beacon.
I'm gonna be doing some freelance for them, starting
Yeah,
around Thanksgiving, so I'll
yeah.
be starting there too.
Yeah, John Howell has given a lot of people their start. If you get around the state, you're going to run into more people than not who have worked there at some point. And the great thing about working for John when you're that young is he throws you in the deep end and says swim. He'll let you try anything, and especially if you work in sports, because John will be the first person to tell you that he doesn't know much about sports. But what he does know is that if he hires someone who's qualified, he will let them do the job, and he will let them try anything at least once. For me, when I started there, I had never taken a photo, I'd never done layout, I'd never scheduled freelancers, I'd never run a story budget of any kind. It was all new. It was all learning on the job. But it was great for me because it was smaller. It allowed me to make some mistakes. It allowed me to try some things and maybe not try them again, or maybe run with them again. It was a really good first job in terms of it being like a training ground in a way. And I really get to try some different things there, and fail a few times and learn from that, and succeed a few times and continue those. Yeah, that's a special place. It's definitely somewhere that if you ask around, whether it's in media or in communications in the state, you'll find that quite a few people have worked there.
Wow, I didn't realize it. Now I'm even more excited for that.
Yeah.
But as we hit our last like 8 or so minutes, what is your favorite team to cover if you have one, and why is it the Red Sox?
That's right. It's the Red Sox because baseball was my first love as a kid, and baseball is the game that I played for the first time ahead of any other sport, and that's always going to have my heart. But like I say to people all the time, I want something that's intense and well played that people care about. I don't care what sport it is. I don't care what level it is. The other part of that is I want to watch people who are great at what they do perform. And the example I use all the time is Elizabeth Beisel. I don't know anything about swimming, and still don't after all these years. But I remember seeing her for the first time at a state meet when she was at North Kingstown. She had either made her first Olympic team or was about to make her first Olympic team. And I remember watching her in a race, and I thought, "Whoa, what is this?" I'm like, "What's going on here? Who is this person, and why is she just destroying everybody?" And she's only 14 or 15. Like, what's going on? And you do a quick Google search and you see that she's got all these national age group records, and she's a star with her club team, and she's already got a couple pool records at URI as a 13-year-old, and you're just like, oh wow, okay, like this person athletically is special and has a chance to do some great things. And then you meet her personally, and she's so engaging and outgoing, and just an absolute quote machine. It made her great to cover for so many years. And sometimes you get lucky in that way. You get to cover people who are the best at what they do. If you watch someone like Kwity Paye when he was at Hendricken, he's flying right now with the Colts. They're having a great season. Kwity was such a great athlete at Hendricken, so humble. His story is incredible. As a refugee from West Africa, ends up here. Mom was such a nice lady, hard worker, supported her kids the way she did, to get them to points where their lives would be better than hers. You run into things like that along the way. And, so yes, baseball is my favorite sport, but sometimes you find either other events, other people, other stories that will attract you more than what you might think you like best.
Wow, interesting. What do you make of the Red Sox offseason? What would you like to see them do after a surprisingly successful season?
Well, I think anyone who watched the World Series should realize what the talent level is for the best teams in the sport, and they are not close in my mind to the Dodgers and the Blue Jays. Realistically, if you're going to try to play a 7-game series against either one of those two teams, and we do like the schoolyard draft where everybody lines up on the foul line and we pick teams, The Red Sox will not have as many players picked as some of their fans might think. There'll be a lot more Dodgers and Blue Jays picked to play in those series. I certainly think if they can finish the Joe Ryan trade, which they started on before the deadline, that would give them a real number 2 starter behind Garrett Crochet. That would close the gap a little bit, to extra guys like Bayo or Crawford or anybody else who ends up in that rotation next year, maybe Connolly early or Peyton Tolley. But you need another quality starting pitcher. I'd like to see them go after a leverage bullpen arm because I am skeptical whether or not Aroldis Chapman can have such another terrific season when he's 38. I don't know if Garrett Whitlock can do this again because he hasn't been as durable as you would like him to be. And you may want to pull back on his usage a little bit next year, and that would mean you need someone for the 7th to the 8th inning behind Chapman. I also think that they're a couple bats short, at least. Alex Bregman has opted out of his contract, which means whether you re-sign him or you bring in a replacement, you still need Bregman replacement, and another bat. I think you need at least 2. So they've got some work to do, certainly. Craig Breslow spoke a little bit about that at the GM meetings earlier this week in Las Vegas. He said they need a better starter, and certainly they want to engage on some hitters. I think you'll see them involved in potentially trading an outfielder, whether it's Jaron Duran or Wilyer Abreu. They have pieces to move if they'd like to acquire some players at other positions. But it's just a matter of what direction they choose and how forceful they want to be, because they have a chance to improve and be back in the playoffs next year.
How about the Bruins and Celtics, 2 teams kind of in opposite spots? The Bruins have won 7 in a row now, and the Celtics, understandably, not off to their best start without Tatum, but still they're around 7-7. What's your outlook on both of them?
I don't think we're hanging any banners in TD Garden this year. Obviously when Jason Tatum gets hurt last year in the playoffs, and you could argue whether or not they were going to win that series against the Knicks in the first place. They were in trouble. It looked like a team that had gotten to the end of the road, sort of. So I think the Celtics are in for a little bit of restructuring. Even if Tatum was still playing, I don't necessarily think that they're up to the standard that the championship team was. The Bruins, I have no idea who any of their guys are. aside from like Pasternak, Swayman, McAvoy. That's a completely new team from the one that was in the Stanley Cup Finals the last time. Guys like Bergeron and Marchand and Carlo, they've all moved on. It is a completely different team, a different look, a team that's not expected to contend at or near the top of the league. The Bruins for me are sort of a, check in with you later. That's sort of their status right now. I won't lie and say that I'm watching them every night or even every third night, because I just don't feel like they're really going anywhere.
I'd have to agree there. Lastly, how about Rhodey and PC? What have you seen from them so far?
Well, Providence certainly more talented across the board. I think they did better in the transfer portal. They identified some guys from other high majors and were able to bring them in. You or I have questions about the league. Only 6 bids in the last 4 years to the NCAA tournament. I think the Atlantic 10 has really gone backwards in this modern era of immediate transfer eligibility and NIL. And I think URI is in a really difficult place right now with respect to that, the structure in the sport, fan dissatisfaction with Archie Miller, the fact that there's apathy there, that attendance is low. I wonder where URI is going to be in the near future. I wonder if there is a path there that even exists anymore for them to be a regular contender atop that league.
It's tough. I was there like every game as a student, and now it's not even a year later. I can name maybe one player. That's the way it is every year. They cycle through players. It's rough for Rhodey right now. But not for all Rhodey athletes. Tristan Levesque, the pitcher from the Rams, got drafted to the Savannah Bananas last night. I don't know if you saw that.
I did not.
But I have to give a shout out to him. He was a guest a few months ago. I had him with the Schooners and the Rams. Check out that interview, folks. We're going to wrap this one up. We're just about at an hour. we haven't forgotten about Thor Bjorn. I promise that. So, Bill, what happened was I was supposed to have Thor on the day the news broke.
Oh, wow.
He's going to UMass. Like 2 days before that, they said he can't make it with a meeting. Then that story broke. So I'm like, oh, I get it now. Like that certainly changes things. But they did say to check back in with him once he's settled in. So we haven't forgotten about Thor. We've got other connections on the way. Jay Ulmer, a minor league pitcher for the Red Sox and Arizona Fall League, will be with us next week. So tune into that. But thank you, Bill, so much for your time. Great catching up with you, and love seeing your stuff out there. And I'm sure I'll see you at various high school games and any game in the area, really.
No, Andrew, it's my pleasure. Thanks for having me on.
Thank you, Bill. That's going to do it. This is Andrew Fiore signing off on Fiore Call.
Been in the game since he was wet behind the ears of Underkin, I know it all, been spitting it for years. Fiore calls game. Fiore calls game. Fiore calls game. Fiore calls game.